Hi, and welcome to the Fancy Comma YouTube. Today I'm joined by John Dos Passos Coggin, a writer, artist, and public policy communications professional working in climate, clean energy, and conservation. He worked for a decade as a federal communications contractor supporting climate and clean energy communications at 3 U.S. government agencies. Coggin also has a parallel career in creative writing. His first book, an authorized biography of Florida Governor and U.S. Senator Lawton Chiles, entitled Walkin Lawton, was published in 2012. He also writes nonfiction essays, screenplays, and poetry. Finally, as the grandson of renowned American author John Dos Passos, he co-manages the Dos Passos Literary Estate. Welcome, John. It's great to speak to you because, as I told you last week when we tried to record and had hella technical issues, I did my high school thesis on E. E. Cummings, who went to college with your grandfather and was evidently his really good friend. So it's nice to make another connection with someone that I have studied extensively in a different way. I haven't read any Dos Passos, but I definitely will after speaking to you. It's on my list. So you were a federal contractor working with NOAA at the beginning of President Trump's second term. How did you lose your job, and what happened to NOAA's work on climate and weather?
Yeah, that's correct. For 6 years, I was a federal communications contractor working for the NOAA Climate Program Office. My contract position was eliminated on May 30th of this year as part of a general downsizing of my contract. It was not just me that was laid off. I was part of a group of more than a dozen communications workers who were let go, most of whom worked on climate. What happened in my experience was just one part of a gigantic mural of hurt and damage that happened to science, this federal science enterprise. So not just NOAA, not just the Climate Program Office, the whole span of the federal government experienced eliminations in the science agencies. So NOAA, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy. It was a broad effort, and it didn't happen just once in 1 month. It happened over a series of months. It was a succession of waves. It was like, a big set of 100-foot waves, swells crashing onto the government. And it's continuing. It's not over. There are more losses to come, more layoffs across labs, science agencies.
Climate, obviously, there's a lot of stuff happening. Like the people that worked on climate.gov are now forming climate.us. Did you ever work on climate.gov?
I did. Yeah, I worked with the climate.gov team a good bit. I was on the same communications team before the second Trump administration arrived. Our team was about 16 or 17 people total. So part of our team was devoted to climate.gov. I was not working full time on climate.gov like some of my colleagues were. I made contributions really in the form of occasional publications, guest features, guest interviews, and features analysis of Climate Program Office research, the results of that research, progress from that research. But yeah, I know that team really well. That the group of including Rebecca Lindsay, really chief among them, whom you interviewed before in your interview series. She and others founded climate.gov and gave it a soul and a voice, and created its reputation, which is incredibly prestigious. And now they're finding ways through private philanthropy to continue that project, and under a new name, under Climate US, which is great.
They just raised, I think, $100,000 recently. So what have you been up to since you lost your job at NOAA?
I've been very busy, just as busy as I was working at NOAA, if not more so. And there's kind of the rhythm, the natural rhythm now that I'm in of following the job market and applying to jobs every week. But on top of that, I have had an opportunity to double down, triple down on my creative career that runs in parallel to my interest in government and service, writing more poetry, writing creative nonfiction, maybe down the line having enough time to get going on a new film script again. I also co-manage my grandfather's literary estate, so in this time, I'm really having an opportunity to focus on the new initiatives that my mother and I have planned for that. I'm working on final edits for an forthcoming compilation of his short biographies. He was throughout his career of 40 books and many magazine and newspaper articles. He was an aficionado of the brief biography, the sketch portrait. Um, Many times those were satirical, so they were portraits. Probably the most famous of his portraits were the ones that were a part of the multimedia experience of the famous USA trilogy. So um, his short, precise biographies of Henry Ford, of William Randolph Hearst, of Teddy Roosevelt, Andrew Carnegie, the many big personalities and newsmakers of the early 20th century America. And what this compilation proposes to do, the reason why I began it, working on it, is to reintroduce John Dos Passos to the American reader as a master of this art form, of the short biography, and show that it was part of his entire career, his entire literary career, not just the USA trilogy. He was writing really, really skillful short biography throughout. And when you look at all these um, biographies together, you really have a new work of art that really deserves re, attention from the public, from critics, and because they're so short, it really can be a wonderfully brief and fun read that you can take to the beach or use in the classroom.
Short stories are really overlooked as an art form. When I was in high school, I really enjoyed writing short stories because they're fast to write. I wouldn't say they're like easy to write, but you can get a story written that has a relatively nuanced, poignant message. I won some national awards for my writing of short stories in high school, and it's fun to write short stories because you don't have to have a lot of time. The other thing that you mentioned about writing biographies, you really learn a lot about humanity writing biographies, especially of like famous people. You learn about like their struggles and stuff like that. So, who was John Dos Passos, and what kind of work do you do for his literary estate? You've already talked about some of it, but can you tell us about John Dos Passos as a person and writer?
Well, he was a primarily known as a novelist, as a fiction writer, and a chronicler through his best known novels, his real masterwork novels were what he called chronicles. And by that, he meant they very much followed the true events of American history, of society, of the economy, of politics. They were joined with fictional characters and events, but he wanted very much them to follow the grain of true problems, true crises in American society, issues of war and peace. What the big example being the USA trilogy. He that story follows the development of the United States of America from the turn of the 20th century up to the very beginning of the Great Depression. So you have fictional characters and real biographical portraits that are all hung on the main events of that period. So World War One being one of the biggest, as well as the Spanish flu, as well as the Roaring Twenties, the lead up to the crash of '29, the crackdown on civil liberties during World War One, the rise of industrialism, of combinations, of massive vertical and horizontal integrations of the Gilded Age. That was kind of a mold that he followed in his novels the rest of his life. He wrote Mid-Century, which was a follow-up to that, largely the same format of biographies mixed with third-person omniscient fiction, mixed with autobiographical sections, and also headlines of the day, which he called newsreels. So, so going back to the beginning, he he was primarily a novelist, but he also wrote nonfiction. He also wrote poetry. He wrote in newspapers, editorials. There was very little that he did not do in his very extensive career and long life from 1896 to 1970. He saw so much of the 20th century, and because he was really a family man and really moderate in his appetites and pursuits. He was a passionate man, but he knew his limits. He was blessed with long life, and had a family and was a really good father and a family man. And that was rare in his generation. The lost generation, well, and in many ways they really were lost, and many of them came to ruin and didn't live very long. But he was someone who we still revere in my family, and I work hard, just as my mother has for her whole life, to support his legacy, to reflect on his legacy, and to keep it going.
That's awesome. So when you say lost generation, you mean, as I understand, lost generation is like people that were serving in World War One, maybe? What is the lost generation?
Well, I think it's hard to define. I think the writer Gertrude Stein was the creator of that moniker, of that tag phrase. I think she said, "You're all a lost generation," I think, and then that phrase stuck. And I think it probably means a lot of different things to different people. I'm not sure there's one true definition, but probably the main things that are consistent are, being born around the turn of the 20th century, um, and and that meant that you were probably involved in some way in World War One. Many of them, like my grandfather, were ambulance drivers. They were deeply affected by the rise of modernism, by a lot of different wild avant-garde movements, Cubism in art, Dadaism. People were just breaking apart old Victorian and Edwardian traditions left and right, whether it was in literature, or art, or music, in jazz and ragtime being those reflections in music. And but I say by and large, those were all milestones in their lives that defined what that generation was. And many of them in the literary world happened to all be friends. And that was true with my grandfather being friends with Hemingway, with Fitzgerald, with Cummings, with Carl Sandburg. I think that's one of the really special, really, really special things about that generation, was just how deep their friendships were and how they supported each other in the arts. And when somebody needed a loan to get through, to the next paycheck, and to make their lives work and make their career work, they were friends in that way, and supported each other, and they read each other's drafts, reviewed each other's work. There's a lot of reasons to find that generation interesting.
Yeah, that's so interesting that they're the lost generation, and then I guess there was a generation between them and the greatest generation. Or was that the next generation that went to World War II? It kind of took a turn from like lost to somehow being like the greatest. After the greatest generation, we had boomers, then we had Generation X, then we had millennials, then we had, what was it, Gen Z, and now we have Gen Alpha. That's so interesting how it kind of like cycles between like generations that have like really good names and generations that have really bad names. But one thing I wanted to ask you about was your grandfather served in the ambulance corps, and actually so did E. E. Cummings. Also served in the volunteer ambulance corps. According to Wikipedia, it says that in 1917, E. E. Cummings enlisted in a different ambulance corps, the Norton Harjes. I don't know how to say this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
American Volunteer Motor Ambulance Corps. Actually, maybe that's the same one as your grandfather, because that's what they just are listed in different names on Wikipedia. What was the friendship of E. E. Cummings and John Dos Passos like? They both went to Harvard together. They're both American writers. Do you know anything about their friendship?
I'm not a scholar by any means of that part of his life, and I don't know, much about the details of Cummings' career. I do know that the Norton Harges uh, ambulance corps, yeah, they were both in that corps. I don't think that they actually served side by side in the same battles, because I know my grandfather's letters really well, and I don't recall in his diaries and letters from the front him mentioning Cummings at all. But um, they, even if they weren't actually serving in ambulances next to one another, they certainly had similar experiences, and I think they probably did know each other in the literary scene at Harvard as well. They were similar also in the respect that World War One was this deep gash in their emotional and political lives that they wanted to reflect on and put into words, and so my grandfather did that in two novels, One Man's Initiation and Three Soldiers, and Cummings did that in The Enormous Room. And then I don't know a whole lot about how their friendship continued over the span of the decades after, but I do know that um, when towards the end of their lives, when my mother was born in 1950, and during that period they were visiting each other. Cummings was visiting our farm here in rural Virginia in Westmoreland County, and my grandfather was visiting the Cummings farm in New Hampshire, Joy Farm in Silver Lake region of New Hampshire, and so my mother still recalls those visits. They would take long walks together at our farm, and we have a nice picture in our collection of Cummings visiting our farm. So that's really we certainly cherish those parts of that legacy.
That's pretty cool. They have so much in common. It's almost like in my mind, they're like twins. But I say that without having read any Dos Passos. I really am going to go to my local library and see if they have Three Soldiers, which they probably, I'm assuming they do.
Yeah, that's great.
I looked up your grandfather, John Dos Passos, on Wikipedia, and it says Dos Passos is known for his shift in political views. Okay, so before I talk about this, I want to say that I have read All Quiet on the Western Front because I was forced to do so in high school, and it was all about like the trench warfare of World War One and how it disillusioned everyone. That's based on a true story about Eric Maria Marquet, who wrote that. But after your grandfather was in World War One, he became interested in actually socialism and pacifism, and he traveled to the Soviet Union in 1928. And it says that he became disillusioned with left-wing politics while also severing his relationship with Ernest Hemingway or during the Spanish Civil War. And then by the 1950s, he had actually become more conservative, and in 1960 he campaigned for Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon. Do you know anything about the political evolution of John Dos Passos? Like, how does that happen? That's a really interesting evolution.
Yes, it is. It's an arc, a storyline from his life that fascinates a lot of critics and biographers and writers, and even up to today. It's probably one of the two or three parts of his life that's most studied and reviewed and questioned. I think if you were to ask him today, he would say that the Spanish Civil War was the turning point in that arc. That was the pivot point. And when he arrived to report on the Spanish Civil War, he arrived an idealist, a believer in the cause of the Spanish Republic, of democracy, a believer in the idea that U.S. presence and attempts to support the democratic movement, the health of democracy in Spain could succeed. There were a lot of Americans and some British who came. For example, George Orwell was another writer. Of course, Hemingway was there. reporting on the Spanish Civil War. And both my grandfather and Orwell were deeply disillusioned by what they saw on the ground on the front. And the details of that were that what on the surface appeared to be a pure ideals driven movement to preserve Spanish democracy and keep it out of the hands of Franco and his fascist forces was in fact deeply corrupted and manipulated by Joseph Stalin. And in a lot of ways, I think with the benefit of hindsight and archival study and decades hence, we now understand that in a lot of ways the Spanish Civil War was a proxy war. There were larger powers, Stalin being chief among them, who were manipulating the anti-fascist forces, and that became very personal for my grandfather when one of his good friends, Jose Robles, who was a Spanish translator working in Spain, was executed by the many firing squads are operating in Spain, who were there were continuous purges at the behest of the Soviet Union. And so after that, returning to the United States, my grandfather wrote very darkly about and with great disillusionment about socialism, about worldwide communism. He never thought about it the same way again. And Orwell was the same way in the writings that he did about communism and about Spain after the war. So yeah, it's a massive point of evolution in his life.
So while you were talking about that, I actually had never heard of the Spanish Civil War. So I was looking it up on Wikipedia, and it was thought to be a prelude to World War II, and it was between, it sounds like socialists versus like fascist kind of people. The nationalists won the war. The nationalists ruled Spain, it says, from early 1939 until Franco's death in November 1975. They had a war in Spain and socialists won the war.
Actually, no, the fascist won.
Oh, the fascist one. Okay, that makes sense. So then how is Franco still alive in 1975? I thought Franco was part of the Axis powers. Maybe I need to learn about Spanish history. Wow, so that's crazy.
Yeah, fascism took control of Spain at the end of the war, and Franco was a very long-lived dictator, living right up until the 70s, as was Salazar in Portugal. So it was a tremendously complicated war. One of the reasons it was complicated was basically the Republican side was so deeply factionalized. It was a reflection, I think, of a lot of factionalism within the Communist Party and socialism. People who wanted it to go in every different direction possible. They all had different agendas, but it was really that the executions and the execution of Robles in particular that changed my. There was really a scar in my grandfather's life, and there was a documentary, Robles Duelo al Sol, made in Spain in 2015. I was a part of that documentary, working on it with Sonia Tercero Ramiro, the director and producer, and there have been a lot of other efforts to write about that. There was a book called The Breaking Point that came out about how the aspect of that of the Spanish Civil War, where there was essentially a strong disagreement, a passionate disagreement between my grandfather and Hemingway over that aspect of the war. My grandfather feeling deep disillusionment, wanting to wash his hands of the struggle for communism um, and leave behind the idea that Americans could find a way to keep to their ideals and support the Spanish against the fascists. Hemingway really thought that uh, I think that struggle could continue, and he wanted it to continue. And he produced a documentary, "The Spanish Earth," about the Spanish Civil War, to try to show his alliance and fellowship with the Spanish people. But Hemingway and Dos Passos, their friendship was never quite the same after that war. So it changed. It was a marker for many writers of that period. That was really a flashpoint for George Orwell too. That was a big driver he why he wrote 1984 and wrote Animal Farm in the way that he did. That disillusionment, that strong streak of satire that came out of the Spanish Civil War. Orwell, of course, was severely injured in the war. He was shot through the throat by a sniper. Remarkably, the sniper hit his vocal cords and not any major arteries, so he was able to uh, survive that and come home to England. But that he was changed forever too.
I mean, it sounds like your grandfather was definitely changed by the war. It sounds like after seeing what happened in that war, he just completely. Did he support socialism before? He sounded like he was pro-pacifism. Was he a pacifist his whole life, or did those views change? What caused him to support Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater in his later years? Was it the Civil War that influenced him to become more conservative, I guess, or?
Yes, I think by and large that was the driving factor that continued to weigh on him the rest of his life, and impacted how he voted and how he supported candidates in U.S. politics. So I think the question he was asking most of the time in the 50s, 60s, and then he died in 1970 was, what candidate is the most anti-communist? That was a question that a lot of American conservatives were asking at the time. But the way that my grandfather crafted it in his mind more specifically was that he believed that he was always consistent in his pursuit of checks on aggregations of power, of concentrations of power. So wherever power was concentrated, and concentrated to the degree of great corruption, that was where he wanted to challenge those combinations of power and fight for what he thought of as the struggle for individual liberties, for rule of law, for a well functioning American democracy. By that definition, before the Spanish Civil War, he believed that concentrations of corporate power were the most densest and most dangerous combinations of power in American society. So that's what made him a socialist and communist sympathizer. Um, Although he generally disliked labels, I think he would have said that he was a sympathizer with those movements and thought that they had a lot of potential to reshape American society and put the balance of power back into a fairer, more just posture where people had more power and government had more power and labor had more power versus corporations. So if you flip that around, I'd say after the Spanish Civil War, he started to believe that in fact the pendulum had swung, and the greatest concentrations and the greatest dangers of power in American society were in fact in labor and in the communist infiltration of the labor movement. So he was very critical, very skeptical, and wrote as much about Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters, other major labor unions. But then I think if you take that up to today, I would say that if my grandfather were here today, I would say he was a very keen observer and chronicler of American history and politics, and he would have almost certainly noticed that the pendulum has swung once again, and the American Union movement is almost dead. It's almost gone, And in its stead, you have vast swaths of corporate power and new combinations, new media, new types of corporate power like social media that are completely unchecked. You have the Silicon Valley, which didn't exist when he was writing. And I think he would probably venture to say that he might correct his compass once again and write about unchecked corporate power. I think about probably if you were writing today, you would be writing a lot about Silicon Valley and writing a lot of strong satire of Silicon Valley. If you think about his political beliefs as being consistently targeted toward the need for checks and balances and pushback against vast aggregations of concentrated power, I think you would recognize that these days government power and labor power are very small compared to corporate power, and that the sort of the new mold of corporations that we have today, that so new media like social media, the internet, AI, all those sorts of new corporate powers, new models of how corporations work, those are largely unchecked. The by design, entities like Facebook, they try to keep their definition of what they actually are quite vague, so as to avoid the possibility of being covered by federal regulations. And I think he would see that federal government in the American society that we have right now probably can and should be a check and a balance that looks out for the public interest and balances it against the corporate interest. And uh, I think he would be very suspicious, very skeptical, and probably writing, deeply satiric um, materials about Donald Trump, because for his entire life he was certainly against he was an anti-fascist and an anti-demagogue, and even even to the extent that John F. Kennedy and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were very charismatic people. He, I think, was suspicious of leaders who were guilty of oversimplifying and um, playing on short term whims and just the notes of charisma, and not really being cerebral about problems. He was skeptical of demagogues as being purveyors of kind of just flashes of charisma and flashes of emotion. I think my grandfather always wanted to be on the side of caution, cerebral positions. Everything for him was the function of a lot of time and thought and effort.
Um, can you tell us about the three novels that John Dos Passos wrote that were a political fiction called the USA Trilogy? They're The 42nd Parallel, 1919, and The Big Money, and they were published from 1930 to 1936 and published together in 1937. So that was like right before World War II and possibly during the rise of fascism. Even though it's a political fiction, how do you think that fit in with the politics of the time?
Yeah, it's by far the best known of his works. He wrote 40 or so books, but the USA trilogy, which was kind of in the first third of his career, is the best known. Those three novels document the rise of the American character, I guess I would say, from the turn of the 20th century to the very cusp of the Great Depression. So, by the American character, I mean the the grand, powerful forces that were shaping American society and becoming so potent, so sweeping that there aren't really any heroes or big personalities in the USA trilogy who were able to push back against those forces. And I would say that the main forces that he was concerned with were militarism, industrialism, materialism. These decades, the first 3 decades of the 20th century, those were when the United States started to become a global power, with a global military, with a modern presidency and a modern White House, the features of a modern economy. He was satirical of the speed and the power of those forces that were overtaking society, almost making decisions for us before we can even figure out what they mean and what we should do with these technologies, with these trends that are shaping the United States. And so I think anyone who picks up that trilogy today finds a host of parallels between what Americans were dealing with and now. What are we facing right now? I would wager that we're overwhelmed with new technologies and new trends and new forces that we don't quite understand, say artificial intelligence, but we're they're moving at a speed that is breathtaking. I think those novels, rightly so, have stood the test of time. I hope that folks who listen and see this interview will be encouraged to pick them up again and discover them for the first time, or rediscover them and see that these novels are not trapped in time. They're timeless, and that the struggle against these vast forces of technology, militarism, materialism, so forth. That's what that describes America today.
Yeah, I am definitely going to read those. One thing that has been missing from my life has been, amidst all of the depressing news, the contextualization of like ourselves in history. Like what's happening in our world is nothing new. I'm sure like John Dos Passos knew like very well because he was a journalist and he was a historical fiction writer, that these powers always exist, but it feels very difficult without context, which is why we read books, to learn and make new connections between ideas. We kind of like didn't really talk as much about the effect of you losing your job as a government contractor on your life, but it sounds like you're quite busy with managing John Dos Passos' literary estate. Is there anything else you wanted to mention about that, or anything else that we didn't talk about today?
I think we covered a lot. I think we covered some great stuff. I'll mention one last thing that I think is important, which is I'm really moved and appreciative of the community that's grown, of displaced, dislocated federal workers since the beginning, since the waves of terminations and layoffs and so forth began in this administration. I think it's really wonderful, the online and offline communities that have grown in the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I am. There's probably communities in other places too, where people are helping each other look for new jobs, helping each other look for freelance work, helping each other just stay emotionally supported, keep a schedule and a rhythm to their life, and reshape what their life, what their identity is after losing what's a really strong identity, which is the identity of being a civil servant, someone with a mission to look out for the public interest, whether it's science or elsewhere in the federal government. I just want to recognize that, and I have a lot of empathy for the many other folks who are in my same situation, who are starting over, taking another look at their life, at their career, figuring out what their next steps are. It's tough, but I think the way to work through it is to keep building these communities and look out for each other.
Yeah, I think there's definitely power and strength in community. I really do think that federal workers really need a sense of community in this time. I feel like we live in a kind of political chaos, but we always have. It's just always different by the day. Back in the day, your grandfather had communism versus fascism, which I think that's like the most extreme. I hope we never see that again, because that must have been really odd to live through. Wow. But yeah, maybe there are some lessons to be learned for the current time in reading some Dos Passos. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today, John. It was great to chat with you, and I learned a lot, and I think our viewers will find this really interesting and cool, because I found this really interesting and cool.
Terrific. Thank you so much for setting this up, and I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope others do too.